Welcome to a truly boring history, a soft-spoken journey through forgotten corners of the past. Tonight, we'll quietly step into another bleak chapter of history, told not with excitement, but with quiet honesty. If you're just settling in for a peaceful listen before sleep, we'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if this kind of slow, haunting historical storytelling helps you unwind, don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how sorrow was once carried not just in the heart, but in silence, ceremony, and the long wait of ritual. When someone died in ancient China, the grief that followed did not begin with feeling. It began with duty. Before a tear could fall, before a name could even be spoken in mourning, the question was asked, what role did you play in the family, and what rituals were expected of you? Grief was not yours to shape. It had already been shaped for you, hundreds of years ago, by the rites of filial piety and ancestral law. You didn't grieve because your heart was broken. You grieved because Confucius said you must. When a father passed, his eldest son did not simply cry. He dressed in hempen robes, moved into a mourning hut outside the home, and stayed there for up to 3 years. He withdrew from society, refused meat and wine, avoided music, and stopped shaving his beard. These were not gestures of emotion, but symbols of respect. Each day of that mourning was scripted. The pain might be real, but it was no more important than the procedure. And if the son smiled too soon or left the hut too early, it wasn't considered healing. It was considered dishonor. But what if you weren't the eldest son? What if you were the youngest daughter? Or the widow? Or the servant who had known the deceased since childhood but had no name in the family record? Then your grief did not belong to you. You were expected to be quiet, respectful, and invisible. The mourning rituals you were allowed to perform, if any, were not based on how deeply you felt the loss, but on how the world ranked your relationship to the one who died. Even if your entire world had crumbled, the hierarchy remained solid, cold, unbending. You were not given space to weep in your own time. Instead, you followed the mourning calendar. How many days you must cry, how long you must wear plain robes, when to kneel, when to bow, what words to recite before the ancestral tablet. Your sorrow was scheduled, as though grief could be measured with sundial and soothed by ritual alone. There was no room for personal memory, for sudden floods of sadness in the night. Those were private, and they had no place in a culture that feared chaos more than silence. Ritual was the boundary between you and that chaos. It taught you how to behave when the world ended, but not how to feel. So you went through the motions because you had no choice. You poured water into bowls with shaking hands. You bowed 3 times, even when your legs were weak. You said the words written for you, though your heart did not understand them. And in doing so, your grief disappeared into tradition, tidy, honorable, quiet. Because in ancient China, you didn't mourn to remember. You mourned to obey. In ancient China, the death of a parent was more than the loss of someone who raised you, someone whose voice shaped the walls of your childhood. It was a collapse of the structure that gave your identity meaning. You did not just lose a mother or a father. You lost the very name that held your place in the world. From the moment you were born, your position within the family hierarchy was mapped with care. You were someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's promise to the ancestors. But when that parent died, the balance shifted. Suddenly, you became incomplete. You weren't just grieving a person. You were mourning the pillar that gave your role in society its shape. A son might inherit the title of head of the household, but it came with a burden carved in stone. He was now the vessel of his father's unfinished legacy. He had to mourn correctly, speak correctly, perform rituals correctly, not out of personal sorrow, but to show the ancestors that the line would not falter. If he failed, it wasn't just a social error. It was a spiritual offense. His father's ghost might never rest. His children might suffer. The community might whisper that the heavens had turned away from their household. For daughters, the shift was quieter, but colder, if unmarried. She might be hurried into marriage before mourning ended, because an unattached woman had no place in a grieving house. Her sorrow was folded away like the hem of her robe. If married, she often returned to her husband's family during the mourning period, expected to honor her birth family's loss in silence. far from the home where she once belonged. Her grief was something to be managed, not honored. And for mothers, the ones who lost their husbands, the transformation was perhaps the most hollowing of all. Overnight, she became a widow, a title spoken not with sympathy, but with quiet instruction. She was expected to retreat, to reduce her presence, to embody her grief in stillness and obedience. If she smiled in public, she was judged. If she wore color too soon, she was whispered about. Her loss became her identity, not her companion. But even deeper than these visible roles was the erasure that no one said aloud. Once the parent died, the relationships inside the family changed. A younger brother might become responsible for an elder's duties. A woman once called daughter-in-law might find her status questioned if no male protector remained. And children, especially girls, who had once been held close, were now seen as weight to be reassigned. The death of a parent was not just a funeral. It was a reorganization of the living. You tried to carry on. You bowed when expected. You burned paper offerings. You wore the right cloth. But inside, the ache was deeper than any ritual could reach. Because even as you honored their name, your own began to vanish, chained by absence, swallowed by expectation. No one asked how you felt. They only asked if you remembered the right prayer. And so you did what they all did. You folded your name into silence and let tradition speak for you. In the stillness that follows a death, most people expect silence. But in ancient China, after someone passed away, silence was only allowed in its appointed time, just as tears were allowed only at theirs. You didn't cry when the pain rose. You cried when the ritual said you should. From the moment death entered a household, time itself changed. There was a schedule now, written not in hours or minutes, but in rites and ceremonies. The process of mourning wasn't chaotic. It was orchestrated, like a performance passed down through centuries. From the first announcement of death to the final day of mourning, every emotion you showed, if you showed it, was scripted. At the moment of death, the immediate family was expected to cry out in grief, loudly, desperately, but not because their grief burst from within, because it was their duty to be heard. The cries served a purpose. They were assigned to the ancestors, to the village, and to the officials that the household still remembered its place in the cosmic order. A good family wailed for the dead. A bad one stayed quiet. But after the initial cries, the tears became more complicated. The mourning period was divided into stages. At each stage, the clothes changed, the food changed, and the grief, too, was expected to evolve. You were expected to cry, openly, audibly, during certain rituals, before the coffin was sealed, before it was carried from the house, at the burial site. But in the days in between, you were expected to control yourself. Too much weeping was considered indulgent. It was seen as a lack of discipline, a sign that the mourner was more attached to the self than to the proper order of things. It suggested you didn't accept fate. It risked angering the spirits. And yet, too little weeping was equally dangerous. A son who didn't cry enough for his father might be accused of ingratitude. A wife who stayed too composed at her husband's funeral might be viewed with suspicion. Was she relieved rather than bereaved? If someone suspected your grief was fake, you could be punished by shame or worse, by ritual exclusion. So people learned to cry on cue. They practiced. There were even professional mourners, women hired to wail at funerals, to give voice to the sorrow others couldn't afford to show. Their cries were theatrical, trained, unrelenting. It didn't matter that they hadn't known the deceased. What mattered was that their sound matched what grief was supposed to look like. Inside your body, the real sorrow waited. It swelled in the quiet moments, in the long nights, in the memory of a voice you could no longer hear. But there was no place for that kind of grief in the open. That kind of grief was undisciplined, personal, unscheduled. So you waited. You held it in. You wiped your tears not when they fell, but when the ritual permitted. You stopped crying not because you stopped hurting, but because the calendar had moved on, in time. Even your emotions were trained to follow the pattern. And the question was no longer, do you mourn? But rather, are you mourning correctly? When a person died in ancient China, the first concern was not the emotional well-being of the bereaved, nor the gentle tending of wounds left behind by love. The first concern was order, harmony, structure. A death was seen not only as a family tragedy, but as a potential disruption to the balance between heaven, earth, and the ancestral line. And so, the funeral became not a space to express sorrow, but a sacred performance of protocol, precision, and control. In this world, emotions were never enough. In fact, emotions were dangerous when left unchecked. The belief was simple. The world worked because it was held in balance. If you allowed chaos, grief, anger, despair to leak into public life, that balance could collapse. Death, being a moment when that equilibrium was already threatened, required everyone to step carefully, to speak carefully, to feel only as prescribed. This is why funerals were not designed to comfort. They were designed to restore order. Every gesture had its place. Every movement had its timing. The eldest son had to take the lead, regardless of how deeply others may have felt the loss. The body of the deceased was washed, dressed, and placed into the coffin not by those who loved them most, but by those who were allowed to touch the dead according to custom. Prayers were read aloud by assigned family members, their words chosen not from the heart, but from ancestral scripts. Even the placement of the coffin within the home was ruled by tradition. It faced a specific direction, often aligned with cosmological principles. The mourners knelt in particular positions. The incense was lit at set intervals. The offerings, rice, wine, fruit, were arranged in precise order, not for nourishment, but for symbolic completeness. A slip of the hand, an incorrect bow, a mispronounced name, all were believed to offend the spirit of the dead or disturb the peace of the ancestors. And what of sorrow? What of the small, trembling truths that lived inside the hearts of those left behind? They had their space, yes, but a limited one. Mourning was confined to formal expressions, scripted wailing, deliberate silence, ritualistic gestures of sorrow. Tears were not discouraged, but they were expected to match the moment, not exceed it. No outburst, no uncontrolled sobbing, no raw, unfiltered collapse. In fact, a mourner who became too expressive could interrupt the flow of the ceremony, could shame the family, could be pulled aside, corrected, reminded of the bigger picture, that this was not about the loss of one person. It was about the continuity of the entire lineage, about saving face, about showing that even in death, this household obeyed the cosmic structure of the world. It may seem cold, it may seem cruel, but for them, it was sacred. The idea that grief must be framed in ritual was not meant to erase feeling, but to contain it, so that it would not overflow and damage what the ancestors had built. And so, the family played their parts. They knelt, they bowed, they lit incense and recited names they had known all their lives. Some felt every syllable like a knife. Others moved through the motions, numb. But no matter what they felt, the ritual moved forward, slow and solemn, like a river too old to change its course. Because in ancient China, a funeral was not where you came to fall apart. It was where you proved that your world had not. In the intricate world of ancient Chinese customs, grief was never a private affair. It was a legacy to be negotiated. Whether your sorrow mattered didn't depend on the weight it placed on your chest or the tears you held back in the dark. It depended on your place within the ancestral line, and whether those who came before allowed your pain to be seen, named, or even spoken. For in that world, the living did not simply mourn the dead. They performed grief before the silent court of their ancestors. Every funeral, every offering, every whispered name was not just for the benefit of those still breathing. It was to maintain harmony with those who had passed on. It was to ensure they were not offended, that they were remembered correctly, that their place in the invisible architecture of the family remained untouched. This meant that grief was a privilege, one you earned through your relationship to the dead, your obedience to the rules, and your alignment with the ancestral spirits. If you were the first son, your mourning was considered sacred. You were the bridge between generations. Your grief had value, not because you loved more deeply, but because your role carried spiritual weight. But if you were a wife, not a deceased, but his younger son, or perhaps a granddaughter too far removed from the family's inner circle, then your mourning was less visible, less formal, and less recognized. You may have held their hand through their final days. You may have been the only one who spoke their name with tenderness, and yet At the funeral rites, your presence was quiet, secondary, sometimes even unnecessary. You could not lead prayers. You could not organize rituals. In many cases, you were expected to remain still at the margins, dress properly, bow at the right time, but otherwise invisible. There were cases when even deep grief was silenced entirely. If the ancestors or the elders interpreting their will deemed your pain inappropriate because you were too young, too distant, too low in status, then any attempt to express sorrow became disrespect. To mourn when it was not your place was to dishonor the dead by overstepping your bounds. But the cruelty of it all was how invisible this judgment could be. The rules were unwritten, passed down through practice and repetition, like inherited silence. No one would tell you, you may not grieve. Instead, they would simply not include your name when assigning ritual duties. You would not be called to the front. You would not be expected to fast or wear mourning clothes. And when you asked why, the answer would be vague. It's not your responsibility. And so, many wept in secret. Their grief became a quiet burden, locked inside the ribs and hidden behind ritual smiles. They lit candles in private corners. They folded scraps of paper into the shapes of prayers they were never invited to speak aloud. They watched the formal rituals take place, grand, scripted, complete, knowing that their own sorrow lived just outside the bounds of recognition. Because in ancient China, mourning was never truly about love. It was about order. And your grief only mattered if it could be placed neatly within the ancestral line. If the ancestors allowed it, you were permitted to ache. If they did not, you had to ache in silence. In ancient China, death was not only marked by sorrow, but by time, and that time was not your own. The number of days you were allowed or required to mourn the loss of someone you loved was not a measure of your affection, your bond, or your emotional devastation. It was determined entirely by your social status, your rank in the family, and your proximity to the deceased within a carefully maintained hierarchy. There were rules, precise and flexible and centuries old, that dictated how long you must wear mourning clothes, how long you must abstain from music, meat, marriage, and joy. The more important the person who died, and the higher your role in relation to them, the longer you were expected to disappear from the rhythms of daily life. For instance, a son mourning a father was traditionally expected to observe a mourning period of 27 months, a ritualized 3 years. That time was meant to mirror the length of time a parent tended to a child in infancy, a gesture of reciprocal devotion. And so, for nearly 1,000 days, the son would withdraw from normal society. He would not sing. He would not dance. He would not wear color. He would live on plain food, dress in coarse cloth, and refuse positions of honor or employment. But that same intensity of mourning was not afforded to all. A daughter might mourn her father, too, but not for 3 years. Her mourning could be as short as 3 months, or if married into another household, omitted entirely under her new family's customs. A wife mourning her husband might enter deep seclusion, her grief visible in her daily silence, her refusal to remarry, but she had no formal mandate to withdraw for years. And a concubine, even one who had shared years with the deceased, might be required to return to her duties or be reassigned, her sorrow pushed aside by her lack of legal recognition. Even among sons, not all mourning was equal. The eldest son carried the heaviest burden, not necessarily because he loved the most, but because he represented the continuation of the family's moral structure. A younger son might mourn less publicly or for a shorter span. If he lived far away, his mourning could be performed in symbolic absence, gestures from a distance, words instead of weeks. And below the family structure, among servants, retainers, and the poor, mourning was often constrained by necessity. One could not afford to disappear for a year from labor. One could not leave the fields, abandon the children, or stop work. So grief for them was often immediate and quiet. A bowed head, a meal offered to the dead, a name whispered, not shouted. The system did not ask whether your heart was breaking. It asked whether your name justified long sorrow. It measured your pain by ritual, not reality. Some bore the weight of long mourning as an honor. Others saw it as a prison, nearly 3 years of stillness, during which the world moved on without them. And yet, it was not a matter of choice. The calendar of grief was inherited. It came to you not with feeling, but with law. And so, in ancient China, when someone died, your first question was not, how do I live without them? It was, how many days must I mourn? And when the mourning ended, after 100 days or 500 or 1,000, you return to life as though the sorrow had passed, whether or not it had. In the grand households of noble families, mourning followed a script. There were robes of undyed hem to wear, altars to prepare, scrolls to read, and prayers to recite. There were rules for posture, for silence, for how many times to bow and in which direction. The house was filled with the sound of ritual, the smell of incense, the rhythm of a grief both public and polished. But in the homes of the poor, mourning had no such ceremony. In the narrow alleys and crumbling huts of ancient villages, where rice was counted grain by grain and winters were survived, not lived through, grief looked different. There were no fine altars, no money to hire priests or purchase offerings, no quiet chambers to sit for months and reflect on the dead. Life of the poor did not pause for sorrow. It only shifted under its weight. When a loved one died, the poor had no choice but to carry out the burial quickly. A family with little land might not have a burial plot ready. They might wrap the body in a simple cloth and dig a grave with borrowed tools, under the eyes of neighbors too tired to help but too kind to look away. The dead were honored not with elaborate rites, but with the raw effort of those left behind. Calloused hands digging earth, tears mixed with sweat. Words spoken not in perfect ritual, but in the rhythm of memory. There were no mourning garments of proper hemp, perhaps just the plainest clothes they already owned, worn until they tore. There was no multi-stage ritual for guiding the soul to the afterlife, only whispered prayers and incense if they could spare it. And if not, they simply bowed their heads, trusting that sincerity would speak louder to the spirits than ceremony ever could. A mother who lost her child still had to wake before dawn and grind grain. A son who lost his father had to take his place in the field the very next day, shoulders aching not from weeping, but from the weight of tools passed down too soon. A widow could not retreat into silence. She had mouths to feed, debts to navigate, and neighbors who might watch but could not help. And yet, it would be wrong to say their grief was lesser. It was not. It was deeper in many ways, because it had no release, no structure, no public moment to cry and be heard, no slow ritual to carry them from pain to peace. Their mourning lived inside the body, in the slowness of movement, in the quiet skip breath, in the long stare into an empty bowl where a voice once sat. There was always the fear, too, that without proper rituals, the spirit of the dead might not rest, that an unritualized death might bring misfortune or unrest to the household. But what could they do? They could not invent wealth. They could only do what they had always done, make meaning from what little they had, and hope that the ancestors would understand. And perhaps they did. Because if there is anything stronger than a ritual carved in jade, it is grief carried by those who must keep walking while it burns inside them. So while the grand houses mourned in incense and robes, the poor mourned in silence and in motion. And though history rarely wrote their names, their grief was no less sacred. In the intricate latticework of ritual, status, and belief that defined ancient Chinese life, death revealed more than just the end of breath. It revealed the borders of what was allowed. And for women, those borders were drawn with unmistakable firmness. Among the most silent, yet devastating of these boundaries was a rule that barred women from touching the body of the dead, even if that body belonged to someone they had loved their entire lives. You could weep beside them. You could kneel nearby. You could scream their name into the folds of your robe until your throat trembled with exhaustion. But you could not touch them. Not once. Not even a hand over theirs. Not even to close their eyes. To touch the dead was considered ritually impure. And women, already seen through the lens of bodily impurity because of menstruation and childbirth, were considered especially unclean in this regard. The preparation of the body for burial, washing it, clothing in the robes of the afterlife, arranging the limbs to face the correct direction, was a sacred act, and one reserved for men. If you were a wife, even of many years, your role was to mourn in posture, not in contact. You were expected to lower your gaze, cover your head, and remain quiet as your husband's brothers or sons, sometimes men you hardly knew, prepared his body. If you were a mother, Your tears for your child could fill the room, but your arms were not welcome to hold him one last time. That final closeness, that final farewell, belonged not to the heart, but to the rules. This distance was not just physical. It was spiritual. It was social. It was a statement. In a world where order was more sacred than emotion, where cosmic harmony was maintained through hierarchy, a woman's touch, even when full of love, was seen as a threat to the ritual purity of death. But what was never spoken aloud was the quiet brutality of this rule. The widow who sat beside her husband's body as it cooled, unable to brush the hair from his brow. The sister who watched the burial from the edge of the courtyard, unseen, unheard, remembering a childhood that now ended in silence. The daughter who heard her father's breath fade in the next room, but was not allowed to lay her hand on his chest to say goodbye. These were not just customs. They were cuts, deep and slow, into the soul. And sometimes in the quiet, when no one watched, the forbidden touch still happened. A fleeting brush of the sleeve. A whisper carried on fingers across a cold cheek. But if caught, it could be condemned, not just as a breach of ritual, but as dishonor, not to the dead, but to the living family who would bear the shame of the act. So instead, women learned to grieve with distance. They learned to fold their heartbreak into ritualized weeping, to express love in incense burned with trembling hands, in the precise bows performed from behind the funeral screen. And afterward, when the body had been lowered into the earth, they remained behind, not to speak of what they had lost, but to resume their roles in silence. Because in ancient China, love was never enough to cross the line that ritual drew. And when you weren't allowed to touch the body, you learned to carry the weight of goodbye without ever saying aloud. In the hours after a death, a strange silence would settle across the home. Not only because the life that once filled the walls had slipped away, but because the living themselves were no longer seen as fully clean. In ancient China, the experience of mourning didn't simply mean remembering the dead or honoring their spirit. It meant becoming ritually contaminated by death. And for that, you had to be separated. You had to be isolated. The moment someone close to you died, particularly if they were a direct relative, your body became marked, not by visible signs, but by a spiritual impurity that society believed could affect the balance of the home, the village, and even the ancestral realm. This belief was ancient and deeply woven into the cosmology of life and death. It wasn't that you had done something wrong. It was that death had passed through you. So, the mourning hut was built. It was a small, crude structure just outside the family compound, or in a quiet courtyard corner, made of wood, straw, and silence. And if you were the chief mourner, usually the eldest son, you would live there, not just for days, but for months, sometimes, as prescribed by tradition, for nearly 3 years. This hut was not a place of healing. It was a place of withdrawal, of deliberate self-erasure. You slept on the ground, ate plain food, wore nothing but uncolored cloth. You did not speak unless required. You did not visit festivals. You did not smile. This isolation was both physical and symbolic. The idea was that your sadness, your impurity, your connection to the death could unbalance others. To see you was to be reminded of mortality. To touch you was to risk spiritual contamination. So even within the family, boundaries were enforced. Meals were brought to you and left just outside the door. Children were discouraged from playing near your space. You were there, and yet you had become almost invisible. And for those without huts, for the poor, the landless, the distant, this isolation took other forms. You might be forbidden from entering temples, forbidden from participating in communal rituals. Even your neighbors might avoid your home during the mourning period, believing that the spirit of the deceased lingered too long in places where grief was fresh. There was comfort in none of it. The system was not built to nurture. It was built to protect the structure of the living world from the unknown, chaotic energy of death. And so you carried your sorrow alone, not just emotionally, but spatially. If you were overwhelmed by sadness, there was no one beside you. If you had questions, there were no warm hands or shared embraces. Just incense, silence, and time. And when, eventually, the mourning period ended, after weeks or months or years, you stepped out your space changed, not only by grief, but by the long echo of having been removed from the world. People welcomed you back with caution. You wore new clothes. You performed cleansing rituals. And only then were you allowed to smile again, allowed to speak as before, allowed to live as though the death that had fractured everything had now faded into history. But the body remembers what it is to be alone. And so, in ancient China, to mourn was not only to cry, it was to vanish. In the rich tapestry of ancient Chinese mourning customs, even the smallest voices were not exempt from the weight of ritual. Children, those who had barely begun to understand the world, let alone loss, were still expected to carry grief with the same quiet discipline as their elders. But unlike adults, who at least had the words and roles to express sorrow, children were often left with nothing but silence. No one asked a child how they felt when a parent died. No one offered them space to cry or be confused. The moment the death occurred, the adults took their places: eldest son, daughter-in-law, widow, brother. And the children were folded into the background, dressed in mourning clothes too large for their small frames, their presence ceremonial rather than emotional. They were taught to bow at the proper time, to kneel when the coffin passed, to remain still during the burning of incense. But the rituals they followed were not theirs. They belonged to the adults, carefully structured, measured, inherited. And so, the grief of children became mimic sorrow, performed without understanding. They repeated the bows they were told to make. They echoed the prayers they were too young to grasp. They stood in the cold morning air during burial rites, holding back tears not because they had learned to be strong, but because they had been taught that silence was a virtue. In many households, especially those that valued strict adherence to Confucian ideals, a child who cried too loudly or clung to a deceased parent's robe might be gently, but firmly pulled away. Emotion, even in its rawest form, was not to interrupt ritual. Grief was not a private storm. It was a public duty, even for the young. Some children learned quickly that the safest way to mourn was quietly, through small gestures that did not disturb the adults. Sitting beside a corner altar long after the family had gone to sleep, pressing a folded paper talisman into the earth, whispering to a spirit they weren't sure could hear. They created their own rituals, not to replace the official ones, but to find space for a sadness that had no name and no permission. Others, especially orphans or those in lower classes, were often too preoccupied with survival to grieve at all. A child who lost a parent might find themselves sent to live with distant relatives or expected to work to support the family. There was no time for mourning, no moment to pause. Grief for them became a shadow that followed as they carried buckets, cooked meals, or swept temple steps. It was not soothed, it was swallowed, and yet within that silence, the sorrow endured. It grew up with them. It shaped how they understood the world. That loss was not something to speak of, but something to perform and then hide. That even in the most intimate sadness, one must obey. Because in ancient China, childhood did not protect you from the weight of death. It simply taught you how to carry it without making a sound. In ancient China, mourning was not a private journey of the heart. It was a public declaration, a performance governed not just by living eyes, but by unseen ones. To grieve was not only to honor the dead. It was to place yourself under the gaze of your ancestors, those generations whose spirits were believed to linger just beyond the veil of the everyday, silently observing, quietly judging. The rituals surrounding death were not arbitrary. They were rooted in the idea that the dead were not truly gone. They had transformed into ancestral spirits, guardians of the family line. And these ancestors, though no longer in the realm of the living, were deeply invested in the behavior of those they had left behind. They did not want only remembrance. They demanded correctness, structure, respect. So, when someone died, the rituals that followed were not just for the comfort of the soul who had passed. They were signals to the ancestors that the living still understood their place in the cosmic order. The depth of your mourning, the precision of your gestures, the sincerity of your prayers. These were all read silently by spirits who could reward or punish. If your mourning was proper, your household might flourish. If not, misfortune might follow. People believe that sickness, poor harvest, or social shame could result from improper mourning. If the wrong kind of paper was burned, if the name was miswritten on the ancestral tablet, if the mourning period was cut short, it wasn't just a family error. It was an insult to those who had shaped your bloodline. And so fear lived quietly behind every bow, behind every offering of rice or wine, behind the way incense smoke curled in the air. Even within the family, people whispered judgments. She stopped wearing mourning robes too soon. He didn't cry enough at the burial. These were not small concerns. They were signs that the ancestral bond was weakening, that someone had forgotten that they were only one link in a chain much older than themselves. Children were taught early that their ancestors were watching. Portraits on altars were not merely memories. They were presences. You bowed before them not just in honor, but in awareness. If you misbehaved during mourning, the shame was doubled, once in the eyes of your elders, and again in the silent court of the ancestors. And the burden was heaviest for the eldest son. He was not just expected to lead the mourning rituals. He was believed to carry the responsibility of keeping the entire ancestral line in harmony. If he mourned improperly or lazily, or too soon returned to joy, it could sever the spiritual link that connected generations. His grief was not just his own. It belonged to the whole family, and the consequences of his failure could ripple outward. Even long after the burial, after the mourning clothes were folded away and life resumed its rhythms, the sense of being watched remained. Ancestral offerings were continued, festivals observed, names recited, not out of habit, but out of obligation, out of a deeply internalized knowledge that the dead had not gone. They had merely stepped back and were waiting. And so, grief in ancient China became not an emotion, but a responsibility, not just to the one who had passed, but to all those who had come before. Because in this world, when you mourned not only for the dead, but before them. In the quiet courtyards of ancient China, as the living struggled to carry on in the wake of loss, they were not allowed to let go, not entirely. For to mourn someone was not only to bury them, but to continue caring for them, tirelessly, respectfully, and materially, long after their body had been laid to rest. And that care often took the form of food, not symbolic food, not gestures, actual meals, lovingly prepared, placed on altars, burned in stoves, or set beside graves. The belief was as old as the earliest dynasties. The dead, though absent from the world of flesh, still experienced hunger. They still needed nourishment. And it was the duty of the living, particularly their closest kin, to provide it. It didn't matter whether you had much. Even in households that scraped to fill their own bowls, a portion of the family's food was routinely set aside for the ancestors. On the anniversaries of death, during the Ghost Festival, and especially during the long mourning periods, these offerings took on greater urgency. Cooked rice, boiled meats, wine, tea, each dish placed with intention, presented with bowed head and careful hands. Sometimes the food was burned, sometimes buried, sometimes left for the night, and removed in the morning, never touched by the living. And if you didn't offer it, that was more than neglect. It was a break in the contract that held the family line together. The dead, it was believed, could grow restless. Hungry ghosts, spirits who had not received proper funerary rites or offerings, might return confused and angry. Not only could they bring misfortune, but they could haunt your household, whispering through the walls, souring milk, bringing illness, or twisting the fate of unborn children. The offerings weren't just tradition. They were protection. This belief weighed most heavily on the poor. Imagine a widow in a village at the edge of a province, her children thin, her grain nearly gone. And yet, when the anniversary of her husband's death arrived, she would still set aside the rice, still boil the broth, still kneel and present it as if he were sitting beside her, because to skip that act was unthinkable. Her grief, her loyalty, and her place in the family's ongoing story depended on it. Some families went into debt to perform proper ancestral offerings. Others borrowed from neighbors. Some prayed extra, hoping that sincerity might compensate for the poverty of the plate. But all understood that feeding the dead was not a matter of choice. It was duty, and in this quiet, heavy practice, something tender persisted. The idea that love did not end at the grave, that even in suffering, the bond between generations could not be severed by death, that the dead still sat at the table, even if no one could see them, that they still mattered, that you still remembered. Because in ancient China, to mourn was to keep feeding those you lost, even if it meant going hungry yourself. When someone you loved died in ancient China, the transformation was not confined to your heart. It extended to your body, your clothes, your posture, even your voice. Grief was not something you simply felt. It was something you became, and the world expected you to wear your mourning in every visible way, like a second skin that could not be removed until the ritual calendar said so. From the moment death entered your household, your appearance had to reflect that shift. The finest garments were replaced with robes made of undyed hemp, a coarse, scratchy fabric deliberately uncomfortable to wear. It was often unhemmed, fraying at the edges, its plainness a visible rejection of vanity, comfort, or joy. There were no colors, no embroidery, no silken sashes. Mourning cloth was a language of loss, deliberately austere, designed to humble. But it wasn't just what you wore, it was how you wore it. Mourners were expected to keep their robes loose, their hair uncombed, their posture slightly slumped. In this culture where elegance and discipline were otherwise prized, grief demanded an unmaking of the self. Your dishevelment was not laziness, it was virtue. It showed that you were too consumed by sorrow to care for appearance, that you understood mourning as a time not for presence, but withdrawal. And even your voice changed. During mourning, especially in the early days, it was expected that you speak less, and when you did, to speak softly, slowly, with little emotion. Laughter was forbidden. Raised voices were seen as deeply inappropriate. A mourner was not only quiet, they were subdued in tone, in spirit, in presence. Even casual greetings were offered with bowed heads, or not at all. You were in the world, but not of it. Grief had pushed you to the edge of community life, and your manner was expected to reflect that exile. The way you moved through space mattered. 2. You walked slower, deliberately, head lowered, eyes not meeting those of others unless required. Public events, festivals, weddings, these were strictly avoided. If you had to appear in public, it was as a figure marked by loss, not one participating in joy. This was not only for your own sake, but to avoid polluting the happiness of others with the shadow of death. Grief, after all, was considered contagious in its own way, not in emotion but in cosmic energy. And all of these rules varied in intensity depending on your status. An eldest son would dress and behave in the strictest form of mourning for the longest time. A more distant relative might follow abbreviated customs, wearing slightly less coarse garments or observing a shorter period of visible sorrow. But the principle remained the same. To mourn was to embody grief, to let it reshape your physical being until the world could see, without asking, what you had lost. Over time, the mourning clothes would change. After the first 100 days, they might be replaced with lighter shades, less coarse fabric. By the end of the official mourning period, months or years later, you would finally wear color again, walk upright again, speak at a normal volume. And with each small shift in your appearance, you were signaling to the ancestors and to your community that grief had run its course, that the world once shaken was slowly being set right. But many mourners never felt that return, because what ritual allowed, closure, completeness, emotion often denied. And so, beneath the colored robe, behind the straightened spine and carefully practiced smile, grief lingered, quieter now, but just as heavy. Because in ancient China, mourning wasn't a feeling. It was a form you had to take, until the world decided it could let you go. In the delicate fabric of ancient Chinese society, grief was not considered an isolated wound. It was a shadow that stretched across time, across relationships, and across every aspect of daily life. And when you were in mourning, that shadow followed you into the world and quietly dimmed its colors. For the duration of your grief, no celebration was permitted, not for the new year, not for harvest, not even for your own wedding. This prohibition was not a suggestion. It was an iron rule rooted in the belief that the energies of joy and sorrow could not occupy the same space. The Eon of death was heavy and still. The Yang of life, of laughter, song, ritual celebration, was vibrant and forward-moving. To mix them was not just culturally inappropriate, it was cosmologically dangerous. If you were in mourning and you laughed too freely, It was said to dishonor the dead. If you participated in a festival while still within the sacred bounds of the mourning calendar, your ancestors might be displeased or worse, offended. They might see your joy as forgetfulness, your smiles as betrayal. And for a society so deeply shaped by ancestral reverence, nothing carried greater spiritual risk than neglecting the dead. So the world around you changed. If your father had died, and it was the first spring since his passing, you would not attend the flower festivals blooming through the streets. You would not hang bright lanterns. You would not touch the firecrackers. While neighbors laughed and drank rice wine beneath pink blossoms, you stayed inside, tending incense in memory. Your home would remain subdued. No music, no bright colors, no celebratory meals. Weddings were postponed for years. Even if a match had been arranged, even if the dowry had been exchanged, the union would wait until mourning ended, because love, like joy, was seen as incompatible with death. And a household that welcomed marriage too soon after loss risked losing ancestral favor or attracting bad fortune to the new couple. Some mourners never remarried at all, choosing to preserve the purity of their sorrow rather than risk offending the past. Children, too, were bound by these rules. A young boy who had waited years for his coming-of-age ceremony might see it delayed. A girl preparing for her hairpinning ritual, a symbol of adulthood, would have to wait, her own life paused by someone else's death, because grief was not personal. It belonged to the family, and it commanded sacrifice. Even everyday pleasures were muted. You might refrain from eating certain foods, from visiting friends, from playing music or singing aloud. For months, sometimes years, your life was marked not only by what you did, but by all that you withheld. And when people saw you refrain, when they watched you leave the room before a song began or bow quietly as others toasted, they understood you were still grieving. You were still honoring. And though this restraint was sometimes heavy, there was a beauty in it too, a shared language of stillness, a recognition that sorrow was not weakness, but continuity, that in silencing your joy, you kept the memory of the dead alive. Because in ancient China, celebration was sacred, but so was the silence that followed loss. And to grieve properly meant not only mourning with words, but learning to pause your joy until the world was ready to welcome it again. In ancient China, grief was not merely an expression of love or a reflection of sorrow. It was a public mirror of your virtue. The duration of your mourning, its rigor, and its visible burden were seen as more than personal response. They were measurements of your character, your values, and your standing within both your family and society. And because morality was believed to be revealed through action, not feeling, grief became one of the most potent ways a person's inner worth was judged. The idea that grief must be long and visible in order to be honorable was deeply rooted in Confucian philosophy. To Confucius, filial piety, one's duty to parents and ancestors, was a cornerstone of all moral life. And the greatest test of filial piety came not in how you serve your parents in life, but how you mourn them in death. The 3-year mourning was a most revered form of this devotion. It wasn't exactly 3 years by modern count. It was 25 to 27 lunar months. But the symbolism was clear. Just as a child depends entirely on its mother and father in the first 3 years of life, so too must a child devote 3 years to mourning their loss. To grieve for 3 years was to live in ritualized sorrow, wearing coarse mourning robes, abstaining from meat and alcohol, avoiding music, declining social roles or promotions, and stepping back from any public sign of pleasure or ambition. It was an act of self-erasure, not because the mourner wished to disappear, but because their absence from joy was a form of presence to the dead. They disappeared in honor of someone who could no longer appear. But what if someone could not or did not mourn for that long? If a person shortened their mourning period, returning to work, to color, to celebration too soon, it was seen as a reflection of weak moral fiber. Perhaps they were thought ungrateful, perhaps selfish. Rumors might spread. He wore white robes for only a year. She accepted a marriage proposal before the second winter. They didn't even burn offerings on the 1-year anniversary. These were not just idle observations. They were indictments. For officials, such deviations could be career-ending. A man seeking government appointment might be evaluated on how strictly he had observed mourning for his parents. if he had taken a post during a prescribed period. It was assumed he placed ambition over virtue, a sign of someone unfit to guide others. In some dynasties, taking public office while still within the mourning period was strictly forbidden, even if the empire was in need. And for women, too, moral worth was measured in mourning. A widow who chose not to remarry was honored, sometimes even canonized in local lore as a model of virtue. But a woman who re-entered society too quickly, who smiled too soon, or who wore decorative hairpins during mourning, might be shamed or ostracized. Her grief was supposed to be not only sincere, but lifelong. What often went unseen in this moral economy of sorrow was a difference between true grief and its performance. There were those who mourned deeply but quietly, who struggled in silence, and there were those who mastered the rituals, who wore their robes and burned their offerings with flawless precision, but whose hearts remained untouched. But the system made no space for such nuance. It rewarded the visible, it honored duration, and it measured the invisible by what could be seen. In this way, grief became a form of public currency, a way to show who you were, what you valued, and whether you deserved the trust of others. It was not only the dead who were remembered during mourning. It was the mourner who was studied, remembered, and sometimes judged for years to come. Because in ancient China, sorrow was not a matter of how you felt, but how long you carried it. And your moral worth was not found in your tears, but in how long you chose to keep them from drying. In a world where the line between the living and the dead was as much a matter of ritual as a breath, the death of a person in ancient China was not fully real, at least not spiritually, until it was formally announced. It wasn't enough for family members to know, for neighbors to whisper, or for a body to lie still. The unseen world had to be informed. The spirits had to be told. And not just the spirit of the one who had passed, but the entire ancestral realm. This was not superstition. It was structure. And within that structure, the ritual of death notification served as the crucial first step in transitioning the soul from the chaos of the moment of death to the calm continuity of the afterlife. The ritual was called Gaozong, and it began almost immediately after death. A male family member, typically the eldest son or another close male relative, would kneel beside the deceased and perform the formal announcement. This was not done with tears or broken voice, but with careful, respectful clarity. The words were specific. They declared the name of the deceased, their age, their lineage, and the time and date of their passing. Why such precision? Because the spirit, newly detached from the body, was believed to be disoriented. It was in a liminal space, not yet an ancestor, not yet at peace. It needed guidance, recognition, reassurance. Without it, the soul might wander, confused and afraid, caught between realms and unable to settle. Once the death was announced to the deceased, the next step was to inform the ancestral spirits. In many households, this meant going to the family altar, where tablets bearing the names of past ancestors were kept, and lighting incense. The mourner would kneel and speak again, this time to the departed generations. Your descendant has returned to you. So-and-so has left this world. Welcome them, receive them. The tone was never casual. It was solemn. Each word carried the weight of obligation. This act also had another function. It restored cosmic order. The death of a family member was seen as a rupture in the spiritual fabric of the home. By notifying the ancestors, the living were asking them to restore harmony, to accept the new spirit among them, to close the breach between realms. It was an invitation and a plea. But what happened if the announcement wasn't made? The consequences, it was believed, could be severe. An unannounced soul could become restless. It might linger in the house, bringing illness, dreams of dread, or strange misfortunes. The household might feel off, shadows in corners, sudden drafts, a quiet that didn't feel empty, but full, and people would know the ritual had been neglected among the poor or the unprepared. Sometimes the formal ritual couldn't be performed exactly. There was no altar, no priest, no incense. But the essence remained. The death had to be acknowledged aloud. Someone, somewhere, had to say the words that allowed the soul to understand it across the threshold, and that it would not be forgotten, because death in ancient China was not the end of participation in the family. It was simply a transition in role. The living made room for the newly dead by informing the older dead, link by link, across generations. And in doing so, they kept the chain unbroken. So when death came, you didn't just cry or pray. You spoke to the spirit that had departed, to the ancestors who waited, and to the world beyond, so that the silence of loss could be replaced with the order of ritual. In the realm of ancient Chinese mourning, grief did not end with the final breath of a loved one. It extended to the earth itself, where a person was buried, how deep the grave was dug, what object were placed within, and even which direction the tomb faced. These decisions were not merely practical or personal. They reflected a world where death was woven into the very structure of society, where spiritual beliefs and social hierarchy determined not only how one lived, but how and where one would rest. Burial was never just burial. It was alignment with family, with heaven, with the ancestors, with the rhythms of the cosmos. For the wealthy and noble, elaborate tombs carved into hillsides or built beneath great mounds of earth offered both spiritual prestige and enduring memory. These sites were carefully chosen through geomancy or feng shui, an ancient system that balanced natural elements to ensure harmony between the resting place and the spiritual forces of the land. A proper tomb site had to face water, be shielded by mountains, and remain open to the wind, but not too exposed. The goal was to create a resting place so attuned to the forces of qi, the vital energy of life, that the soul could settle peacefully and the descendants could inherit prosperity. But for those of lower status, the story was different. Peasants and commoners were often buried in communal plots, sometimes on the outskirts of towns or villages, with less precision and fewer resources. These graves lacked ornate markers. There was no tomb guardian statue, no carved stone. Yet even among the poor, care was taken. A broken pottery bowl might be placed over the head. The body might be laid in a particular direction. Symbols might be scratched into wood or earth. Simple gestures that still honor the dead and acknowledge their passage. And always, the burial site carried meaning. A son would seek to bury his father close to ancestral ground, if possible, to maintain spiritual proximity. Lineage graves were prized. To be laid beside one's forefathers was not just sentiment. It was a continuation of the familial bond. To bury someone far from their roots, without ceremony, was considered a second death, the death of connection. Even within families, hierarchies shaped the land. The father's grave was placed in the highest, most central position. The mother, slightly beside or behind. Sons and daughters radiated outward, according to birth order and gender. Burial was a map of the family's values, encoded in stone and soil. But what if the grave was not in the right place? It was feared that misaligned burials could disturb the peace of the dead, or invite unrest among the living. A wrongly placed tomb might bring illness, business failure, or broken marriages to descendants. And so, if misfortune struck, some families would consult geomancers, dig up the dead, and move the graves to better align land. The act of relocation, though costly and emotionally fraught, was justified by the belief that death, like life, required correction when the order of things had been disturbed. Women, especially widows, were sometimes buried apart, especially if they had remarried. A first wife might be honored with position close to the husband's ancestral tomb, while a second wife might be excluded. Social roles in life translated directly into spatial positions in death. And what of the unclaimed? The criminal? The dishonored? They, too, had places, often bare and neglected, away from village boundaries. Their graves were rarely visited. Their names, if remembered at all, were spoken softly, because in a world so ordered, even in mourning, dishonor remained a barrier that no ritual could fully overcome. So when the last rites were spoken, and the incense faded into the air, and the coffin was lowered into the earth, the act of burial in ancient China was never just about putting a body to rest. It was a final message to the world. This is who they were. This is where they belong. And may they, through earth and ritual, find the peace that this world could not fully give. In ancient China, to mourn deeply was not only to feel the weight of absence, it was to slowly retreat from the fabric of daily life. Grief was not something you carried with you into the marketplace. into halls of administration, or into the spaces of joy and celebration. It was something that required physical distance, emotional withdrawal, and social silence. And this quiet retreat was not only expected, it was revered. From the moment death entered a household, those closest to the deceased began a long and solemn separation from ordinary society. For some, especially firstborn sons or widowed spouses, that withdrawal could last months or even years. It wasn't merely symbolic. You stepped away from roles of leadership, rejected personal advancement, and refused all forms of public recognition. The deeper your sorrow, the less space you took up in the living world. One of the clearest signs of this retreat was the act of resigning from office. A scholar official, no matter how high his rank, was expected to give up his post when a parent died. Even if he served the emperor directly, he would step down and return home, where he would observe the San Yen Sang, the 3 years mourning period. During this time, he would not draft edicts, sit in court, or accept any praise. His service to the state was put on hold. His only duty now was grief. For those who did not hold titles, withdrawal still shaped every movement. A merchant in mourning might close his shop. A teacher might cancel his classes. A young man might refuse marriage proposals. All music stopped. All color was removed. The boundaries of one's social presence shrank, until only ritual remained. The home, too, became a quieter place. Windows were kept shuttered. The loud clanging of pans in the kitchen was softened. No firecrackers. No bells. Meals were plain and eaten in silence. Children, even if too young to understand, were taught to lower their voices and avoid laughter. Mourning reshaped the soundscape of an entire household. This retreat wasn't punishment. It was purification. In Confucian thought, death disrupted the natural harmony between heaven, earth, and man. The living, touched by death's shadow, needed time to reattune themselves, and society gave them that space. The world didn't push them to move on. It gave them room to stay still. But such withdrawal also came with burden. A widow confined to her home might find herself increasingly isolated, her days repeating in quiet labor and prayer. A scholar removed from court might fall out of favor, his absence remembered less kindly than his grief intended. The cost of withdrawal was real, but so was the fear of what came from grieving incorrectly or too lightly or too soon. And when the time came to return, when mourning ended and robes were changed and color returned, the re-entry was not sudden. It was gradual, hesitant, and marked by ceremony. One did not simply step back into life. One was guided there, through offerings, through burning paper money, through final words whispered to the ancestors. Only then, once harmony was believed to be restored, could the mourner begin to live again. But even then, something remained, a soft boundary between the world they had known and the one they rejoined, an invisible thread of memory, stretched between ritual and emotion, a quietness that followed them long after the last incense had turned to ash. Because in ancient China, to grieve properly was not to cry the loudest, but to step back, to dwell in stillness, and to let the world continue without you, until it was time to return. In ancient China, death was not merely a mystery to be discovered in adulthood. It was a presence, constant, instructional, and woven into the earliest layers of a child's awareness. From their first steps and first words, children were quietly inducted into a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a veil. And through stories, rituals, and the daily rhythm of ancestral practice, they were taught not only to honor death, but to fear it, carefully, respectfully, and with solemn understanding. Unlike in many modern societies where death is often hidden from view, softened by euphemism or kept behind hospital curtains, in ancient China, death was everywhere. In the incense rising from home altars, in the hush of morning clothes, in the empty seat left at the New Year's table. It appeared in the way names were spoken when someone passed. It was present in the way laughter was lowered when someone mentioned the ancestors. It lingered in the hush that followed the telling of a ghost story. And children absorbed these silences, even before they understood their meaning. The fear that was taught to them was not terror. It was reverence. They were taught that the dead continued to exist, not in a faraway place, but in close proximity, the spirit of a recently departed grandparent, might be watching, listening, dwelling within the family tablet, or even within the wind that rustled through the rafters at night. These were not fictions. They were sacred truths. And with that belief came consequence. Any misstep in ritual, any failure to bow, to offer, to observe, could cause harm, not just to the child, but to the entire household. Children were often given tasks in these rituals. They would learn to light incense, to pour water into tiny ancestral cups without spilling, to kneel beside elders during the Qingming festival and help clean the graves. These acts were not simply chores. They were introductions to responsibility in the cosmic sense. You were taught early that your actions mattered to people you could not see, and that if you forgot them, they might remind you. Stories reinforced these lessons. Ghost tales were not only meant to thrill, but to instruct. A careless child who mocked a funeral might be haunted. One who played near a grave without permission might fall ill. A child who refused to bow before a great-grandfather's tablet might bring shame to the lineage. These warnings shaped behavior, but also emotion. They formed a delicate understanding. That love for family included the dead, and that disrespect for them had lasting consequences. Even play was affected. In some households, children were discouraged from whistling at night or playing games that mimicked funerals. They were told not to point at the moon, not to sweep at dusk, not to sleep with their feet facing the door, because the spirits walked there. Whether all adults believed these teachings didn't matter. What mattered was that the lessons were passed down, embedding in the child a lifelong sense of ritual gravity. And so, grief was not an event for children. It was an inheritance. By the time they experienced the death of someone close, they already knew what to wear, how to kneel, how to cry without wailing, and when to remain silent. They had seen mourning before they could name it. And when it came for them, it felt less like a break in the world, and more like an ancient rhythm returning, quiet and inevitable. Because in ancient China, children were not shielded from death. They were shaped by it. And in learning to fear it, they learned how to remember. By the final stages of mourning in ancient China, when the ashes had long cooled, when the offerings had become routine and the loud grief had faded into silence, what remained was not just memory, but something deeper, something quieter. Ritual. It was ritual that stayed after the pain dulled, ritual that gave form to what the heart could no longer speak aloud, and ritual that allowed the living to keep walking, step by careful step, through a world that had once collapsed around them. In a society where personal emotion was rarely expressed in public, grief had to find its place elsewhere. And it found that place in ritual. Repeated gestures, familiar rhythms, precise movements carried out not because they made sense in the moment, but because they had always been done. And because doing them again and again somehow made the unbearable bearable. There was a ritual for waking and lighting incense. A ritual for bowing 3 times before a wooden tablet. A ritual for folding robes the same way your mother did when her father died. These were not grand ceremonies. They were small, deliberate, and intimate. And in their repetition, they gave grief a shape. In a world that changed with every passing season, ritual was a thing that did not change. And when your heart no longer knew what to feel, it was ritual that moved your hands. It taught you that suffering could be survived through structure. Even the act of burning paper money or joss goods, small representations of clothes, houses, servants, was more than symbolic. It was a way to continue caring, to transform love into action, even across the boundary of death. A widow who had no words for her grief could still burn folded silver, watching the ash rise like breath. A son who could no longer weep could still kneel at the ancestral altar and let the smoke do the speaking. The gestures became the language. Ritual also gave grief its beginning, middle, and end. It told you how long to wear mourning clothes, when to switch from white to gray, when to eat meat again, when to attend weddings again. It reminded the mourner that grief, while powerful, was not eternal. Not because forgetting was expected, but because continuity was sacred. Ritual did not erase pain. It absorbed it, honored it, and eventually carried it forward into memory. In this way, ritual did something extraordinary. It transformed grief from an individual burden into a communal practice. You were never truly alone in mourning. The same words have been spoken by your great-grandparents, the same bow performed by generations before you. Even in solitude, you were surrounded by echoes. And for those left behind, those who survived the loss of parents, siblings, spouses, children, ritual became the one act they could still offer again and again across years and decades. On cold mornings at the ancestral tomb, during the Ghost Festival, at the New Year, with every cup of wine poured into the ground, the mourner whispered, "I remember you." And perhaps there was a quiet promise behind all the ritual, that while the world forgot and the seasons turned and even the heart began to heal, the hands would remember, because in ancient China, suffering was not wasted when given form. Ritual didn't erase pain, it gave it meaning. And in that meaning, the mourner found not just sorrow, but peace.